Mr. Ballingrud, sir, how are you
Yeah,
doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So, first of all, congratulations on the book. I mean, I love the first book, and then I went to this one, and I really didn't know what to expect because that's quite an out there kind of concept. So I was really curious to see where you took this one, and I loved it because it's so different, but at the same time, it really does kind of link to the previous one without kind of needing to have recently just read the first one. Because I was quite
Yeah.
concerned maybe because I read so many different books for interviews, etc., etc. I was like, should I read the first one first or not? Do I need to? No, I said no. I'm going to dive into the second one and see what happens. See if it refreshes my memory. And pretty much after 2 or 3 pages, I was straight back into it. Remember the characters and everything. So it's perfectly done. It starts off perfectly well.
I'm very relieved to hear that because that was what I wanted to. That was what I was trying for, but I wasn't sure it actually worked. So you're the first confirmation I've had that it was successful.
Yeah, I mean because that's my kind of my main fear with I don't read too many sagas because of that because they
Mhm.
usually kind of get released a year or 2 years after each kind of saga. So I was quite kind of dubious as to whether I'd enjoy it or not, and I really enjoyed it so much, and I loved it even more so the fact that it's a really condensed book, but at the same time it just feels like such an expansive story. It felt like it reminded me a little bit of Joe Abercrombie's The Devils, which is like a 600-page brick, and it just even though it was only 100, just over
Yeah.
100 pages, it really felt like I'd really lived that world so much more than just 2 or 3 hours. Yeah.
Oh, good. Good. Well, thank you. I'm so happy to hear that.
Uh-huh. Anyway, enough of my praises. Let's get down, let's get down to some questions about the book now. So
Okay.
first of all, I mean, obviously, I imagine you've been asked this before, but I really very curious about what kind of. I know that you said that the idea for Lunar Gothic, this the Lunar Gothic trilogy, was it came from reading Peake's Gormenghast originally, I think, and the phrase Lunar Gothic kind of it got stuck there somewhere, and you were like, ah, this is this kind of the vision that I want to kind of create. So I'm quite curious what it was about that phrase that sparked this world building, and how was that aesthetic evolved? How has that aesthetic evolved from Crypt of the Moon Spider to Cathedral of the Drowned without giving kind of any specifics away to spoil the story?
Well, it the phrase itself I found to be evocative, and I can't remember anymore um how the phrase came about. I think it was one of those things that just kind of bubbled up,
Uh-huh.
like so many other things do, most of which are useless, but this one I kind of glommed onto. I think what appealed to me about it was one was the suggestion of a lunar Gothic, a Gothic that takes place on the moon, has that sort of synergy that I find to be really kind of intellectually stimulating, imaginatively stimulating, of the idea of the Gothic trappings, in a sort of quasi science fictional setting, not necessarily in the future, like something like Alien, but something that was in the past. And I really enjoy the idea of exploring like space travel or space adventures set way before we would ever able to do it. So the idea of when I think of Gothics, I think of the sort of covers of those 1950s or 60s Gothic romances where
Right.
you have the young woman running away from a sinister house behind her. And so I was thinking about that kind of aesthetic, but it's like, okay, well, it's on the moon. And so what is she running away from? And it's just basically, it was little is all it was just it was like chocolate and peanut butter to me. It was just a accidental collision of flavors that I really enjoy separately, and I like them even more together.
Uh-huh. I mean, you mentioned there about the kind
And
of
so,
the sorry.
no, I was just going to go on to your next point, but if you want to interject,
It was just kind
please
of
do.
related to that. Yeah, one of my next questions was going to be about. I mean, you mentioned there that these 60s covers of a woman running away from something
Hmm.
was kind of a big inspiration. Uh, I think kind of the whole idea of it being kind of like a stylized past with a story that feels incredibly present at the same time and also futuristic at the same time. Um, it was very it was kind of it was very referential towards kind of how society treats the inconvenient people in society, especially women.
Yes.
So I'm imagining that you were kind of intentionally using this setting that you just talked about to explore the kind of the historic patterns that still echo today and probably will do in the future. I mean, I imagine that was a big kind of inspiration why you wanted to set it in the past, but also have things that we have now and things that we probably will have, we might have in the future, no?
Yes, that was definitely part of it. I read this. I'm trying to remember the name of the reporter. There was a woman in the late 19th century who went undercover in a New York City asylum, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember her name right now. But if you anyone who just searches that phrase will find her. And she wrote a very compelling account of what it was like for people because she told her editor that she was going to go and get herself admitted as a patient. And so she wrote about the experience. And even though my story is set about 30 or 40 years later, I still kind of like I still sort of drew from that energy. I don't think a lot changed, but I'm already mixing times up so much in the story anyway that I didn't worry about that. But the idea of how we kind of warehouse and remove from public sight, the people who are inconvenient to us, whether they're whether they're our spouses or people who are homeless or just people who are fighting against or with struggling with mental illness. It's that was definitely something that I wanted to. Well, it's definitely something that fits in with the idea of the Gothic because so much of what the Gothic is, there's that classic phrase, the return of the repressed.
Yeah.
And so everything that we try to push away, comes back to us, not always in the way that not it's often in a different form, in a way we might find even more inconvenient than we did at first. And and so that all just felt like of a piece to me. It all felt like it all fit very organically and very naturally. Um, and you asked earlier about how the world is kind of expanding as I go into the next stories. The Again, that feels just very organic. Uh, if there's when I was writing Cathedral of the Drowned, which is the follow-up, um, I just decided to take another Gothic trope, and which each the three stories, I'm basically kind of picking a Gothic trope to sort of play around with as
Right.
I explore new character. And so with part two, we had Charlie Duchamp, and so I wanted to play with the idea of cathedrals and play with the idea of the doppelganger, which is comes up frequently in Gothic fiction. And and so once I had those starting points, the rest of it just sort of flowered from that. I didn't even have to really do a lot of thinking. It just sort of, it just sort of, flowed as the story started to cohere.
Uh-huh. Couple to that, I mean, you mentioned there that the idea of doppelgangers and those kind of things. Obviously, I don't want to give too much away.
Hmm.
Um, but would it be fair to say that this book, which focuses on Maggie and Charlie, both the survivors, but especially Charlie, who's this assassin who seems more visibly broken in this story than anybody else. Um, would you say that you also used his arc, his story arc to kind of challenge the ideas of strength and masculinity, especially who gets to be vulnerable in these kind of stories?
Definitely, definitely. One of the things I wanted to do with the story in particular uh, is play with those different aspects of Charlie, who he actually is, who he thinks he is, who he wants to be, none of which are exactly the same thing. And add to that how he's perceived by the people around him, either as an oppressor or a tool or just another victim. Um, and it was interesting to me too to play with the roles of the oppressor and the oppressed, and switch his role in second from the first, and with also, without giving too much away, with the antagonist, Dr. Cull as well. Um, Both of them have the power in their hands in the first novella, and neither of them do in the second. And and I'm always we see this on the world stage, we see this on the personal stage, we see this everywhere. The idea of someone who's been victimized for a long time, coming into power, often becomes an abuser themselves.
Yeah.
And so playing with that idea was really at the heart of what Cathedral is about.
Uh-huh. At the same time, because these people are in different kind of positions, I was really interested in that. I read that you a lot of kind of the psychological impact that we see in the story, the psychological arcs, story arcs, was very related or inspired by Hurricane Helene, which you kind of experienced firsthand, and you saw people coming together from all different from different
Yeah.
sectors of kind of the society. Was that something that played heavily on how you wrote the second book?
Well, not so much because most of this, I was deep, deep into the story by the time Hurricane Helene hit, and I was in the final stages of it. I was late delivering the story because of it.
Right.
But but the story itself had already sort of it had already cohered and revealed itself to me at this point. What was interesting about that was let's see. Well, I the sense of shared purpose and community that developed around here, and which you always read about happening after a disaster in certain places where people who are left to their own devices help each other out. They come together, and these
Yeah.
these chasms between us that have seemed insurmountable before, suddenly they're not there, and they're just another person who needs a hand. And that was very, you know, that was galvanizing. That was such a relief to be a part of that and to see that that could still happen. Um, I hadn't thought about how it impacts or how it relates to the story in Cathedral, but I think, and maybe it doesn't much, but I think the idea of so one of the other ideas of Cathedral, the two core ideas, one we just talked about, the other one is just about, um, as in so much of my fiction, just the idea of love, being loved, looking for it, trying to find some kind of acceptance. I think this is a bedrock element of the human condition. I think that no matter where we fall in any particular spectrum, we all need that and want that. And so the characters in the story are driven by this, and they're driven to strange places ultimately by it. But I think this is also what drives us and enables things um, like a community coming together, a riven community restitching itself, at least temporarily, to get through a particular traumatic event. I think those are both coming from the same well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, yeah. Uh-huh. It also the book also it kind of addresses a lot of how well a lot of things are hinged on inherited memory and kind of the idea of truth being shaped by institutions is very kind of this very heavily referenced in the book, um, especially in how the story treats how we said there about mental illness and dissent. Were you using this
Hmm.
institution kind of as a metaphor of how society handles rebellion and nonconformity? And now, how do you think horror fiction can help us to kind of question what's real and what's not, especially in this era of kind of competing narratives and fake truth and all of these kind of things?
I'm sorry, you froze again just for a moment there,
Frozen
but I did get
again.
your question.
You
Um,
did.
Yeah, I think the connection is kind of weak, but no, I did not do that consciously. But I never do anything like that consciously. I'm a much more intuitive writer. I'd never come to a story with the idea of uh, directly commenting on something or trying to make a particular argument or statement. Um, uh, but I do think those kinds of things are there anyway. I think that's just subconscious. I think the role horror fiction. Well, so first of all, with these stories, the idea of memory is intrinsic to all of them. You know, the idea of the stories about ourselves that we tell ourselves. You know, we give ourselves a narrative, and by that, with that narrative, we define who we think we are.
Yeah.
And often that comes into collision with how other people have defined us to themselves. And the fact that memory is so slippery, that it is so unreliable, that it is pockmarked with holes, and that it is often constructed, you know, and not actually what happened, but a memory of a memory of a memory, you know. That's always fascinated me. And so if we follow that and we think about the characters who are trying to, whose memories are being tampered with in some instances, it utterly changes their idea of who they are, which is already kind of unreliable. And so I think horror fiction is an excellent vehicle for so much about critique of this, like of our own psychology. Um, but maybe maybe especially this because I think horror is often about fear of the intrusion of something else, which is often which can be a metaphor for mental illness, could be a metaphor for a lot of more mundane things too. It's also, you know, often a literature of transcendence and being one kind of person and transforming sometimes painfully, sometimes frighteningly into another kind of person. And that can be both that can be both a benefit and a horror, and that sometimes at the same time. And I've often thought that horror fiction, because it is such a good vehicle, because it deals in metaphor, um, it is it feels in a very real sense to be a truer, more honest kind of literature than sometimes what presents itself as realism.
Hmm.
Because it's dealing with, I think, primordial fears and urges and desires that we all sort of harbor and don't always want to talk about. I think too, I was talking to somebody recently about the weird and the surreal in fiction. And this is someone who doesn't read a lot of it and sometimes baffled by why I'm drawn to it.
Right.
And I was thinking about this, and I was just looking out the window now. It feels somehow unreal not to use the surreal as a tool in fiction, because the world feels very, very weird to me right now. I think, to all of us, it's just a lot of essential assumptions, a lot of foundations that we all sort of agreed upon are all of a sudden in question. Nobody's living in quite the same reality, and it's a very unsettling and capital W weird place to be.
Yeah. Uh-huh. That was why I really appreciated the book so much because it really, I mean, I don't know if you were in that kind of in that mindset when you wrote it, but it just felt like it was like all of the characters in this book needed to take a good look at, well, they do take a good look at themselves in the mirror, especially kind of
Mm,
Charlie, because of this doppel. I don't want to give anything away, but you've got the doppelganger in there. You've got there's mention of looking in the mirror, not being able to look in the mirror. Very much about kind of,
yeah.
it's almost as if you wanted to say, everyone, you need to look at yourselves, to have a good look in the mirror and kind of see what's going on around. Was that something that was kind of consciously, you were consciously thinking of when you were writing this specific, especially about the doppelganger? It really kind of made me feel like you wanted to kind of shove a mirror in everybody's face for a
Yeah.
minute.
Yeah. That part was more conscious. because that was so kind of like one of the sort of like basic ideas I had at the beginning that I use as a touchstone. Like I'll go into a story and I'll have like a word or a thought, and I'll just say, just think of this as a centerpiece. And so whenever I'm writing and I start to get lost or don't know what should happen next, I just remind myself of the touchstone. And and often by doing that too, you trigger a subconscious process where when you write, you're not thinking like the metaphors you come up with just so happen to be, they form around that touchstone, not consciously, but it just happens. It's like tuning something subterranean, which is always a joy when it works. And and it was also not just the idea of looking at themselves, but wanting to be apprehended, wanting to be seen for who they are. Another thing that I wanted to that I a note that I hit a couple times in the story was, like the bishop is like, see me. They just want to be they just want to be seen. There's so much confusion about who they are, even in their own minds, but they're desperate to be apprehended and understood by somebody
Yeah.
else.
Uh, and like doing things that maybe goes against them, but yes,
Oh,
exactly
absolutely.
to get themselves seen. Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you mentioned there that you spoke to a friend who doesn't usually read these kind of slightly more bizarre science fiction books, but I'm
Mm.
not. I don't usually read too many of these, but I'm quite curious about how you kind of um, how you balance the kind of the extravagant and the outrageous with the real to make sure that it because what I enjoyed about this was that it really does go to kind of these far out places all of a sudden, but then all of a sudden it comes right back down to kind of a really, it felt like I was reading something that was very kind of grounded and authentic. How do you kind of decide how to balance that, not just um, as a whole, but as you're writing the kind of the different sections of the book? How do you know when to pull it in and to let it go kind of further?
Well, as far as sections go and rhythm goes, that's not something I again, that's more instinctual and organic. It just, you feel like now's the time to do this, to move that way. It's
Uh,
rhythmical. It's kind of melodic, is the best way I can put it. And it's, again, that's not terribly conscious. That's just kind of instinct. But I can say on a more definitive level, or maybe a more granular level, the idea of the balance is completely down to character psychology. Uh, I love to use all the trappings of the Gothic or the weird or the fantastic, the pulp, all those things that brought me joy as a kid. They still bring me joy, and I still like to 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 kind of live in that mental space. Um, but the stories and the characters themselves, I always treat as if I was writing a very serious sort of realist novel. I always treat their psychology and how they apprehend the world around them as if they were in the room with me. I just take them seriously. Is really what it comes down to. And so I'll have a character named Dr. Barrington Cole, and I've got a character who is who's bisected essentially. That's not giving anything away really.
uh-huh.
And it's a crazy situation, but I treat them seriously. Like this is real. This is not a goofy world. No winking at the reader, no saying I know this is silly. It's like you just take it seriously from the get-go.
Yeah.
And I think once you do that, all of that sort of settles into place and takes care of itself.
Uh-huh. No, I mean, I loved. I'm going to use that word now, bisect. Now that you said, but not spoiling anything with bisect. I love that you bisected their character because that just worked so well. It just kind of because you're able to play with this person's emotions twofold,
Mm.
but at the same time, like you said, you kept it really grounded, as if it was just this person ruminating with himself. But it's I bisected at the same time. It just works so well, and it just works so well to kind of echo how people should kind of look at themselves and how they feel they should behave or what's kind of been told that they should behave this way or that way. And it just works so well for me. Yeah.
I'm glad. And it was also a good way for to explore my other character, Maggie, so she could figure out what is it that she wanted out of Charlie. Because she thought she wanted one thing, but here's this other version of him that's talking to her, and that wasn't what she initially wanted. And so up until now, Charlie has been mostly a tool, but now he presents himself as something else,
Mhm.
and it forces her to um, confront how she views herself and her interactions with him and with other people in the story as well, and that causes her some serious complications as well. It was one of those things where it's like you knock a domino over, and all these other things just started evolving organically from it, and you didn't plan them, but you're delighted when they reveal themselves. You're like, oh, that's great for the story.
I don't know. It's fantastic. But at the same time, I don't want to give too much away, but bisecting a person must have made it so much more difficult to, or maybe not, maybe it just helped you, gave you more room to play around with it. But one thing is to say how a person feels in a book, to write, to kind of write it in words, but to write about what happens to the specific character who's been bisected, that must have been a journey and a half to kind of to describe how this person who's had human sensations now has some other kind of sensations, and to describe all of that in in a medium that you're kind of bound by words. It's not something visual that you can show on a screen, you know.
Yeah, it was challenging. It was a fun challenge, uh, but it gave me some pause, and there were a lot of crumpled up pieces of paper and restarting many scenes. And it's the one that is continuing now as I'm writing part three. It's like in a different context now, but still, that sort of like, you know, well, I can't get into it without giving things
Without
away.
giving
But
spoilers
that
away,
sort
you
of like
sure?
yeah, but that fundamental issue of a perspective is still something that I'm playing with and is giving me some headaches some nights.
No, no, but I'm sure it's worth the headaches because the readers, I'm sure the readers are going to enjoy it because I loved it. It was so much more visual than just any other book that I've read, and it's just so different. It just works so well. It's like, yeah, congratulations on that. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the spider webs themselves and the symbolism of the spider webs. It's something that recurs throughout all three books. I think that's kind of the crux of all three books, no? And you've kind of resisted defining them too precisely. I would
Mhm.
say. I'm curious, kind of what emotional, philosophical itch were you trying to scratch when you first came up with the idea? Without kind of, I don't want to give any metaphors or any forced kind of ideas what these represent. But I'm curious what philosophical itch or what emotional itch you're trying to scratch when you came up with that idea.
Well, at first, it first started out, it was part of the trappings. I've got crypts, I've got moon spiders, I've got crypts. There's going to be spider webs. And then I thought about them as being the vehicle for the uh the memory tampering that the character does to his patients, and and then from that came the idea of they're kind of neural conductors, and then they house, if they were for people, then they were for something else too. Maybe they house memories of something else. And so it is still an idea that I'm teasing out even in my own mind as I continue.
Yeah.
And it's also something I don't want to be, as you just said yourself, I don't want to nail down too much, because I think I think a lot of times with these sorts of ideas, the more I define them and to say what I think they might be,
Less
the
interesting.
more the
Yeah.
story, yeah, the story loses some mystery and becomes more
Yeah.
of like a little mechanical contraption. Oh, here's how it all fits and works.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I'd rather have the mystery. I'd rather let I like the idea of the reader filling in some of those blanks themselves with ideas that are more resonant for them than they would be for me necessarily.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure from the first book, and I'm sure you'll get a lot from here, opinions or kind of thoughts that you maybe
Mhm.
never came up with, kind of the idea of what you wanted to say with the web, with the silk, or these kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's happened with other stories, and that's kind of it's the exciting part. A reading I often think of is it's now a book is like an alchemical process. Reading a book is so like it's not finished, I don't think, until it's
Yeah.
read. So I'm putting down a blueprint, and someone else comes and fills it with their imagination
Yeah.
and their own biases, their own psychological point of view, all that stuff. And so whatever they get in the process is going to be different from what I had in my mind. It's going to be different from what the next reader has in their mind. And so the more room you leave for the reader to do that kind of work for themselves, the more specific and I hope uh poignant the experience will be.
Uh-huh. That Kate, we're talking of that then, and because this is a three-part saga, um, do you kind of try to block yourself? I mean, I know it's difficult, but do you try to block yourself out from social media or whatever to not read what people are thinking about the first book so that that doesn't inform you or maybe change what you're thinking about for the second and the third stories, or have you did you write the three
Well,
books?
I do. No, I've been writing them as I go along, so I'm still not done with the third one yet.
Uh-huh.
Um, although it's due very soon. Um, the I've got this lucky sort of uh, uh, mechanism in my mind where once I get into a story, all those other things don't impact it. You know, it's I may just listen to it exclusively and not worry about the opinions of other people. Um, but that being said, I do try to keep a very minimal sort of presence online because I find that doesn't impact a single story so much as it impacts my ability to really kind of like dive into the flow state you need to access
Yeah.
that level of story. Um, it just turns the mind up, and it's little short thoughts, and I need to be able to think longer, quieter thoughts. And I also try to avoid reviews because a bad review can just make you doubt yourself for a long time,
Yeah.
and a good review can knock you off course. You start believing in your own hype, and that's not good.
Yeah.
Um, so
Mhm.
so yeah, I try to avoid it for those reasons.
Uh-huh. Brilliant. Well, just before I let you go, then obviously I know you said you're not quite finished the third book, which is the last one, which I imagine is probably the most difficult one because you've got to tie everything together. No. Um, what can you tell us about the one? I think you have said in other interviews that it centers on the Doctor this time round. Is there much else you can tell us
Yes.
about it? Will it be more? Will it be also kind of like a standalone? It follows on from the previous two, but will it also read like a standalone book that you can dive into that, and even if you read the first two kind of a year ago or whatever, it'll be similar to the second one in that sense that you can just dive in and everything should fit into place nicely straight away.
Yes, that's the intent. So the idea is that each of these is a contained story. They all flow sequentially from each other, but each one is a contained story about that character. So in the first one, you had the woman Veronica. And the second one was about Charlie, who is a side character in the first one. And the third one will be about the Doctor, who has been an antagonistic character in the first two. Pardon me. But yes, this will be his own contained story, even though it follows sequentially from the first two. So ideally, uh, if your memory is shaky of the first two, that won't be a problem.
Yeah.
I can tell you that this one is called Kingdom of the Conqueror Worm. It is the moon that is going to be set around is Charon, Pluto's moon. Even though they discover it before Pluto has been, or that they come across it before Pluto has been discovered in the 20s. And that's going to be what I'm a mausoleum ship, and the uh, the sort of Gothic trope that I'm leaning on here is more ghosts and death.
Uh-huh. Brilliant. This, like I said, it's just reading 100, just over 100 pages, like a sprawling novel. Once these three are published, I think it would make a fantastic, I don't know, more than a film, maybe a series of films or a TV show. Obviously, you've had things adapted into things for the screen. Is this something that when you write it, I imagine you don't think about it being written for the screen. I imagine you just write kind of creating the imagining what the readers will imagine. But could you see this as a
Yes,
as an adaptation?
I would love it, but I feel like it's a long shot. Just because it's so weird, and it's so I'm not going to say it doesn't have uh precedence. That's not what I mean, but it's just I can't think of other um cinematic properties that it resembles. Unless maybe you go back to Vincent Price and Roger Corman and the weird Poe adaptations and some
Yeah,
of the more outlandish horror movies or Hammer horror movies. But if but yeah, I don't think about it. That is that is at least as distracting as
sure.
thinking about what the reader's going to think. It's like then you start writing for, oh, I don't know. You just start thinking about things you do not need to be thinking about.
Yeah, the
And
actors and these kind of things. Yeah,
yeah. And also just as a prose writer, I get disappointed when I think other writers or anybody might be writing hoping for an adaptation. One, the money is good. I know why I hope for an adaptation too. I mean, who there's nothing wrong with that. But if the idea is your story is just an audition for that, and if it doesn't get adapted, somehow it hasn't done what you wanted it to do,
yeah,
or if it does get adapted, somehow it's achieved its final state, that's wrong. The story itself is its highest form. You
yeah,
know, that's the achievement. And if there's an adaptation, that's a variation on a theme. That's great. Cash the check, have a good
yeah,
time, good for you. But it is has no bearing on the actual story.
yeah.
Uh, its worth or its success.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time. I can't wait for people to get to read this one because I know a few people have read the first one, so I can't wait to speak to them about the second one. I wish you the best of success with the launch, and hopefully get to speak to you again about the final entry in the trilogy.
I would love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, this has been great fun. I hope to talk to you again.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nathan. Have a great day, and hope to speak to you again sometime soon. All right.
All right,
Take
take
care.
care. Bye
Bye bye
bye.
now.